Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we're taking an updated look at the gaming performance of the Ryzen 7 2700X, and I'll be comparing it with more modern 8-core 16-thread CPUs such as the Ryzen 7 5800X and Intel Core i7 11700K. Now, the 2700X is a CPU that I really liked for productivity tasks, but I wasn't entirely sold on the gaming performance. I felt for those gaming, the Core i7 8700K was probably a better choice as it was faster in almost every instance, and at roughly the same price it just made sense for those of you building high-end gaming systems, which is why we picked it time and time again in our top 5 best video. The non-X version of the 2700 though, that was really compelling at $300, but again, if you were after maximum gaming performance, the Intel CPUs just seemed like the way to go. That said, for more affordable gaming setups, the Ryzen 5 2600 was a great value option and one that I frequently recommended. All of that said, it was very hard to ignore the 2700X as an option for gamers due to the AM4 platform, which was expected to support the next few generations of Ryzen CPUs. And bar a small hiccup on AMD's side where they briefly thought it was a good idea to axe support on older boards, it's hard to argue that the AM4 platform wasn't vastly superior. So, if you did go with a Ryzen 7 2700X for your high-end gaming system, how is it holding up in 2021, and what does the upgrade to something like a 5800X look like? Today we're going to answer both of those questions with a 30-game benchmark using the Radeon RX 6900 XT. But before we do, I would like to just quickly let you guys know that at long last, we finally have some brand new merch. And due to popular demand, we're also bringing back the old Hardware Box and Hammer on Box merch as well. But the new line is this sweet Hardware Unavailable merch, which is available as a t-shirt or hoodie in one of our standard colors, being black, gray, or blue. The Hardware Unavailable design is just awesome in my opinion. I really love it. We've got the box here falling over with the no force graphics card spilling out of it. And then of course it's being Thanos'd away because, you can't really buy a graphics card anymore since 50% of them were wiped out by miners. Anyway, I do love this one. So if you're interested in getting your own in either a hoodie or a t-shirt or some of the older merch, again, that a lot of you guys have been requesting, then check out our store. The link for that is in the video description. You can go order yours now. Okay, so getting back to the Ryzen 7 2700X revisit. All CPUs have been configured with 32GB of DDR4 3200 CL14 dual rank dual channel memory. Then for the motherboards, for the AM4 platform, we have the MSI X570 Unify running the latest BIOS, and then for the LGA 1200 platform, the Gigabyte Z590 Aorus Master, again using the latest BIOS. Finally, I've tested 30 games at 1080p, 1440p and 4K, and we'll be looking at the data for about half a dozen other titles, and then we'll jump into the usual data breakdown stuff. So, let's do it. Starting with Battlefield 5, we find some rather interesting results. Initially, Battlefield 1 was used for comparing these CPUs, and then once I did move to Battlefield 5, we were using much slower GPUs in 2018 and 2019, such as the GTX 1070 Ti and RTX 2080 Ti. The 6900 XT on the other hand can push well over 200 FPS at 1080p and 1440p. In fact, even with the fastest 8-core CPUs available today, we're still primarily CPU limited at 1080p. So while the 2700X was good for 143 FPS on average, which is certainly a respectable level of performance, it's nothing like the 234 FPS we received with the newer 5800X, and that's an incredible 64% performance boost. It's also well worth noting that the 10700K, which is essentially a 9900K, was still 52% faster than the 2700X, and we also saw similar margins at 1440p. In fact, it's not until we reach the 4K resolution using the ultra quality preset that the game becomes entirely GPU limited using all 4 configurations. Still, it's quite remarkable just how much slower the 2700X is than parts like the 5800X, 11700K, and 10700K when CPU limited, using the fastest 1080p gaming graphics card available. On that note, if I was to run these tests again using a slower GPU like the RTX 2080 Ti, the margins would be smaller and then a lot smaller with something like the 1080 Ti. As an example, the RTX 3070 will limit performance at 1080p to around 170 FPS, and that will reduce the margin between the 2700X and 5800X to around 20%, so less than half of what's shown here. But if you were to use lower quality settings at 1080p or 1440p, then that will once again open up the margin, even with a lower tier GPU. Watch Dogs Legion is another CPU demanding game, and here we find that the 2700X lags behind quite a lot at 1080p, and as a result this time the 5800X was 41% faster, though it is worth noting that the margin was even larger when comparing the 1% low performance, blowing out to 52% in favour of the new 5000 series part. The Core i7-10700K, which again is basically just a 9900K, was almost 40% faster when comparing the 1% low performance. That said, by the time we reach 1440p with the 1600 XT, the margin between the 2700X and 10700K shrinks to basically nothing. Still, the 5800X is up to 28% faster, and that is quite a significant margin, though we only see an 11% difference when comparing the average frame rate. Then at 4K, the game becomes entirely GPU limited, so all 4 configurations produced basically the same result. Still, the fact that the 2700X can produce a 1% low of over 60 FPS and an average frame rate of around 90 FPS means that for most configurations, gamers will be GPU limited with this CPU, as the priority for a game like Watch Dogs Legion is typically visual quality over high frame rates. A 90 FPS average will almost certainly do here. A game where you might require really high frame rates is F1 2020, and here the 2700X does quite well, pushing up over 200 FPS at 1080p. The 5800X, along with the Intel 10th and 11th gen CPUs, were still much faster again, delivering just over 40% more frames, but I think for this title that's an unnecessary improvement. Even at 1440p, where the margin shrinks to 18% in favour of the 5800X, the older 2700X was still pushing up near 200 FPS. That said, we still see a slight performance discrepancy at 4K, but even here the 2700X allowed for 137 FPS on average, so while certainly slower than the more modern CPUs, this isn't a game where the 2700X really suffers to a noticeable degree. But a game where it does suffer to a noticeable degree is Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020. The best the Ryzen 7 2700X can muster here is just 38 FPS on average, and that makes the 5800X around 45% faster, and that's an important margin as it radically changes how the game plays. A similar margin is also seen at 1440p, and in fact it's not until we reach 4K that the GPU becomes the primary performance limiting component, but even here the 1% low performance is noticeably worse with the older Zen Plus processor. The 2700X is well down on the modern 8-core processors in Cyberpunk 2077, especially when looking at the 1% low performance. For example, at 1080p, the 5800X was almost 60% faster, and we're still looking at around a 25% margin at 1440p, though the average frame rate is comparable, but it's the 1% lows that you'll notice. For mid-range to lower-end gaming systems with GPUs only capable of around 60 to 90 FPS at 1440p, the 2700X won't really be letting you down, but for higher-end GPU configurations, you'll want to upgrade the CPU. Testing with Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order shows that at 1080p and 1440p, the 5800X offers around 36% more performance, and it's not until we reach the 4K resolution that the game becomes GPU limited. As was the case with Watch Dogs Legion, this single-player title where gamers are likely going to prioritise visuals, and in terms of performance likely only require around 60 FPS for an enjoyable experience, though personally I prefer around 90 FPS for smoother input, but that's just me. But the point is, you can roughly achieve that with the old 2700X, and it's really only high-end GPU configurations that will benefit from a faster CPU. Call of Duty Warzone is a game like Battlefield 5 where I really expected the 2700X to suffer quite badly, but to my surprise it does okay here. Sure, the 5800X does offer almost 50% more performance at 1080p when comparing the 1% low data, and the Intel 10th and 11th Gen 8-core models are also much faster, but with 172 FPS on average and a 1% low of 131 FPS, the 2700X is hardly slow, and it does allow for high refresh rate gaming. Moreover, the margin is significantly reduced at 1440p. Here the 5800X is up to 24% faster when comparing the 1% lows and 14% faster on average. Granted, both are solid gains, but with over 120 FPS at all times and an average of 170 FPS, the 2700X still enables a great gaming experience and will be able to max out powerful GPUs such as the RTX 3060 Ti, for example. Death Stranding is another one of those games like Watch Dogs Legion and Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order where you don't really need hundreds of frames per second. The 153 FPS average we see with the 2700X is more than enough for high refresh rate gaming in this title. Still, we do see more evidence that points to Zen 3 along with Intel's 10th and 11th gen parts being much faster for gaming. The 5800X was up to 44% faster at 1080p, while the Intel CPUs were around 33% faster on average. The margins are reduced slightly at 1440p as the newer 8-core CPUs start to become GPU limited, and then at 4K we're looking at similar performance for all 4 configurations. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is yet another CPU-demanding single-player game, and although the 2700X was good for over 100 FPS at 1080p and 1440p, it was still significantly slower than the modern options from AMD and Intel. We're talking about almost 60% greater performance with the 5800X and almost 50% with the 10700K. But as the game becomes more GPU limited at 1440p, that margin does close quite significantly, but even so, the 5800X was still 21% faster when comparing the average frame rate and 36% faster when comparing the 1% low data. Again, it's not until we hit the 4K resolution that the margins are neutralized across all tested configurations. Surprisingly, the 2700X hangs in there quite well in Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six Siege, though given that the Vulkan implementation here is rather good, perhaps it's not all that surprising. In any case, we're looking at well over 300 FPS on average at 1080p with almost 300 FPS for the 1% low, so pretty playable performance there. The 5800X is up to 52% faster, which is a massive performance increase, but again, given how fast the 2700X is here, I'm not sure how relevant or useful that increase really is. Not only that, but by the time we reach 1440p, the margins are heavily reduced to just single-digit figures. These results are quite interesting, as I suspect those playing War Thunder might want a little more performance than what the 2700X enables here. Granted, it is still highly playable, but 1% lows of 86 FPS might be a little less than ideal for competitive players. The 5800X was up to 70% faster, hitting 189 FPS on average at 1080p, for what is a truly massive performance uplift. Worse still, this game is so heavily CPU bound that even when cranking the resolution up to 4K, the 2700X is still well over 20% slower than the modern 8-core AMD and Intel CPUs. The last game that we're going to look at in detail is the NPC heavy Hitman 2, and here the 2700X introduces a strong CPU bottleneck at 1080p and 1440p. And as a result, the 5800X, 10700K and 11700K were all 40% faster at 1080p and 1440p. As we've seen a number of times now, it's not until we reach the 4K resolution that the game becomes heavily GPU bound, and all 4 CPUs enable the same or similar level of performance. Okay, so there's a look at a dozen of the games tested. Now it's time to compare these CPUs across all 30 games, starting with the 1080p data, so let's go do that. Here we're comparing the 2700X to the new 5800X, and as you can see, on average the Zen Plus processor was 23% slower, and that is quite a significant margin. In fact, there were just 4 examples where we see single-digit margins, with 8 games where the margin was 30% or greater, with War Thunder, Battlefield 5, Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and World War Z being amongst the worst examples. So if you're using a 2700X with a modern high-end GPU, it is probably time to start considering a CPU upgrade, and the 5800X is a good option. Though perhaps look into the 5900X, as that's typically a bit better in terms of value, despite costing more, particularly for those of you not just gaming. Of course, if you are gaming with a high-end GPU, and super high frame rates aren't a priority, but instead you care more for image quality, at resolution such as 1440p or greater, then CPU performance is a little less of an issue. Here the 2700X was just 13% slower than the 5800X on average, though we do see 8 examples where the margin was 20% or greater. Then finally, for 4K gaming, it's still really all about the GPU, and even with the 1600 XT, we typically saw next to no difference in performance between the 2700X and 5800X. Of course, if you're running an RTX 3070/RX 6800 or better, then it probably makes sense that you'd upgrade to a modern processor anyway. The Ryzen 7 2700X was also quite a bit slower than the Core i7 10700K, trailing by a 19% margin at 1080p, and it's worth noting that the margin to the 11700K is much the same. To be fair though, the 2700X was designed to compete with the Core i7 8700K, and while it was superior for core-heavy productivity tasks, as I said earlier, the Core i7 processor was always better for gaming. So, revisiting the Ryzen 7 2700X in 2021 with newer games and a much more powerful GPU has been very interesting, and as a result there is quite a bit to discuss. I think looking at the results, it's pretty easy to conclude that the 2700X was and is a pretty awful gaming CPU, but I think it's also important to note that it really only looked bad when focusing on the 1080p data, which was recorded using a Radeon RX 6900 XT. To better illustrate what I'm getting at here, let's take a look at 4 generations of 6-core 12-thread Ryzen CPUs compared across half a dozen CPU-intensive games. Now, ignore the number of cores, it doesn't really matter for what I'm getting at here, 6 or 8, the data is going to be comparable. What we want to focus in on here is in this previous benchmark, we found that at 1080p, using an RTX 3090, the 2600X was 31% slower than the 5600X, so not that dissimilar to the 6900 XT data that we have in this video. There's just a few more GPU-bound titles in this latest 30-game benchmark. So the 31% margin seen with the RTX 3090 is obviously very large, but it does drop to 24% with the RTX 3070, and then just 6% with the 5700 XT, a GPU that's comparable in terms of performance to that of an RTX 3060, RTX 2070 Super, and GTX 1080 Ti. So what this means is, if you're using the 2700X with a previous generation $400 to $500 US graphics card, it's not going to be a great deal slower than a 5800X in most games, and therefore will stand up pretty well against the Core i7 8700K. However, purely for gaming, the 8700K has aged better as a high-end gaming CPU, and we know this from our CPU review data, which includes the Ryzen 7 2700X and the Core i5 10600K, which is basically a Core i7 8700K. In this example, the 2700X was on average 19% slower than the 10600K, and that's about what we were expecting to find based on past efforts comparing these CPU architectures. For example, we used to hear a lot from AMD fans that the 2700X would end up being the superior gaming CPU in the future, eventually overtaking the 8700K thanks to those 2 extra cores. However, we did invest quite a bit of time investigating those claims back in mid-2018 with a video titled "Is Ryzen More Future-Proof for Gamers?" and concluded for this comparison, no it's not. That content piece compared both architectures maxed out using demanding games of the time, and this was possible by reducing the core count, and in the end, even with a 50% core advantage, AMD was often up to 15% slower, which was the result of lower clock frequencies and higher memory latency. So, the 8700K was and still is the superior gaming CPU, but what that means for gaming will depend on the user, and in my opinion, there's certainly no wrong option. As I said countless times in our top 5 best CPU content throughout 2018 into 2019, if you want maximum gaming performance, go with Intel, pointing to the 8700K and then later the 9900K. However, if you're also interested in doing some core-heavy work with your PC, it was thought that the Ryzen 7 2700 series might offer a better balance. And for a good part of its life, it was also much cheaper to purchase, dropping as low as $160 US for the 2700X and $150 for the non-X version in early 2020, which was just nuts. And at the same point in time, the 8700K still cost at least $360 US, so it's easy to see why there was so much hype around these Ryzen 7 parts. The advantage of spending more on the 8700K though is the fact that today you don't really need to upgrade. The jump from the 10600K, which is again basically an 8700K, to the 10700K, which is basically just a 9900K, that nets you about 4% more performance on average, according to our 10-game review data. And that's a good thing because the 9900K is really the only upgrade option you have on that platform, and it is still rather expensive, selling for around $300 US on the second-hand market, and that's about what the Core i7 11400F costs new. On the other hand, for those of you that were looking to work as well as game, and therefore invest in the 2700X, you now have the option of upgrading to the 5800X, 5900X, or perhaps the 5950X for a tremendous improvement in both gaming and application performance. So again, there was really no wrong option here, and I can't stress that enough. Despite the endless arguments on forums and Reddit and the YouTube comment section, it really didn't matter which one of these CPUs you bought, or at least there was no wrong option. It mattered depending on what you were after. So what you may have been after may not necessarily have been what everybody was after. So, example, one of these was an affordable 8-core CPU that was pretty well solid at everything, and it came on a really well-supported platform. The other was an expensive 6-core CPU that was great for gaming, but less efficient for most other core-heavy productivity tasks with almost no upgrade path. As for buying the 2700X in 2021 for a second-hand budget build, it's actually not that bad of an idea, and it makes sense for the same reasons you would have bought it back in 2018, so for productivity and gaming. Typically, the 27/2700X chips sell for around $170 US on the second-hand market, while the 8700K costs $200 US, and you can also expect to pay more for a second-hand Intel motherboard as well. The newer Ryzen 7 3700X, that typically fetches about 40% more at $240 US, and in my opinion, it's really not worth that premium. And then you're looking at around $350 for a second-hand 5800X, or $280 for a 10700 series processor. You can save a bit more money on a first generation Ryzen 8 core part, so that might also be worth looking into. Of course, if you're just gaming and you're on a tight budget, a second or preferably even a third generation Ryzen 5 processor is a much more cost-effective alternative. The Ryzen 5 3600, for example, can typically be had for $160 US, and it is faster than the 2700X in all of the games that we've tested. Of course, the beauty of the AM4 platform being that if you have a half-decent 400 or 500 series motherboard, you open yourself up to countless upgrade options. Anyway, that is going to do it for this video. If you liked this revisit of the 2700X, then please do give it a like. You can subscribe for more content. And don't forget the merch. We have the hardware unavailable stuff now, so very cool merch. Love that. Looks cool. So hopefully you guys agree. And if you do want to get it, links in the description. Don't mess around because I don't know how long this will be around for. The previous run, I think we did for about 2 weeks or so. So yeah, no time on this one. Not really sure. So we'll just see how things go. But yeah, very, very cool this one. So don't miss out because yeah, we may not bring it back, or at least we may not for like a year or more. I can't remember when we did the last merch run, but it was a long time ago. You guys have been hassling us. We finally did it. So yay. Anyway, not much more to say on this one. Oh, we also have Floatplane and Patreon if you guys want to get more involved with the channel, support the channel directly that way, get some cool perks in return. Tim and myself do a monthly live stream. We've got Q&As, behind the scenes content, and a really cool private Discord server for all Hardware Unboxed community members. Anyway, also the description link things are in there as well, so check that out if you're interested. If not, perfectly fine, and I would like to just thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve, and I'll see you again next time.